What drives a man to hide his life inside the hollow of a tree, seeking heaven while the world forgets his name? Welcome, dear listener, wherever you may be, resting at home or walking beneath quiet skies. Settle your heart, subscribe to St. Lives, and let us begin together. This is the story of Simon Stock, the English hermit whose despair was transfigured into grace, a man who vanished into solitude, yet became the vessel of a heavenly promise that would rescue an entire order from ruin. The story begins in the soft green hills of Kent, when England was still young and restless, its faith woven through mist and meadow. In this quiet corner of the world, a child named Simon was born, sometime near the end of the 12th century, to a family neither noble nor poor, but marked by an uncommon reverence. The land itself seemed to breathe prayer in those days, the tolling of bells, the rhythm of seasons, the songs of monks drifting from distant abbeys. It was here that Simon first opened his eyes to a world that was beautiful, but fleeting, and already he sensed that something greater waited beyond sight. From his earliest days, he was different. While other children chased the play of sunlight across fields or wrestled in laughter by the stream, Simon preferred the shadowed stillness of the church. He would linger after Mass, staring at the flickering candles, his small hands clasped, his lips moving in silent imitation of the priest's Latin. The villagers whispered kindly about him, calling him the little monk, the quiet one. His mother watched him with both pride and a faint unease, for even she could feel that her son's heart wasn't bound for the ordinary paths of men. As he grew, so too did his inner restlessness. He asked questions that startled his elders. What does God sound like when he speaks in the soul? Why do some hearts feel him closer than others? There were no easy answers, and perhaps it was the absence of them that stirred something deeper in him, a longing for silence, for a space where only God could reply. He would often wander beyond the village, past the hedgerows and orchards, into the edge of the forest. There, beneath towering oaks, he felt the strange comfort of being unseen. The forest was alive with whispers, the rustle of leaves, the call of birds. Yet within that symphony, Simon found a stillness that no chapel could give. It was here, among roots and earth, that he began to sense what he would one day call the holy solitude, the place where the world fades and the soul begins to see. The priest who guided his early years saw the boy's hunger for holiness, but worried at its intensity. He tried to remind him that God dwells not only in silence, but also in service, that to love the Lord is also to love one's neighbor. Simon listened obediently, yet even as he served at the altar, a deeper voice called him away. He began fasting beyond what was asked, waking in the night to pray, weeping without knowing why. His heart burned for something no words could name. Once, when he was still barely a youth, he knelt in the fields at dawn and whispered that he would give his life wholly to God, even if it meant being forgotten by all men. Those words, offered in innocence, would one day become a prophecy. Years passed, and England changed. Kings rose and fell, wars flickered like storms, but in Simon's soul, time seemed to stand still. He studied for a while among clerics, learning the language of Scripture, but books could not ease his thirst. He saw holiness in others, monks who prayed, nuns who tended the poor, yet he could not find peace among them. The clamor of human striving, even in holy company, wearied him. He longed for the quiet that speaks of eternity. And so, as his early manhood dawned, he began to sense the path that few could understand. He would go into solitude, not as one fleeing the world in bitterness, but as one seeking God without distraction. Yet even this decision came with sorrow, for it meant leaving behind family, comfort, and the soft voices that once called his name. One evening, as twilight wrapped the countryside, Simon walked to the edge of the forest once more. He paused where the last rays of light fell through the branches, and he prayed aloud, though no one was there to hear. He asked for courage to surrender everything, to live not for human affection, but for divine love alone. The wind stirred through the leaves as if answering, and a strange peace settled over him. In that moment, he felt that God had accepted his offering. He turned his gaze towards the deeper woods, and though the path ahead was dark, he stepped forward without hesitation. Behind him, the world of men began to fade, replaced by the quiet heartbeat of the earth itself. In the days that followed, Simon wandered through the wilderness, sleeping beneath trees, drinking from streams, surviving on roots and herbs. His body grew thin, but his spirit burned brighter. He sought a place that would be both shelter and cross, where he could die to the world and live only to God. It was then that he found it, an ancient oak, vast and hollow, its trunk wide enough to hold a man. Within its dark embrace, he felt both fear and awe. The hollow smelled of damp wood and centuries of quiet decay, yet to Simon it seemed like a chapel built by the Creator's own hand. He touched the rough inner bark and whispered, "Here, Lord, here I will dwell." And with that, the world outside ceased to matter. Yet even as he prepared to enter that strange home, a flicker of doubt crossed his heart. Could a man truly find heaven in the confines of a tree? Was this madness or faith? He thought of his mother's eyes, the priest's warnings, the laughter of his youth, and for a moment the loneliness ahead seemed unbearable. But as he knelt before the tree's entrance, a soft breeze carried the scent of earth and rain, and he remembered that Christ himself had prayed alone in the garden, that prophets had hidden in caves, that the desert had always been the cradle of the saints. The silence, though terrible, was sacred. And so he entered. The light dimmed as he stepped within. He sat upon the earthen floor, his hands resting on his knees, his breath slowing. Outside, the world continued, children laughing, bells ringing, voices fading into distance, but within, there was only God and his soul. It was a beginning and an ending both. In the hollow of the tree, Simon Stock began the long surrender that would one day draw heaven to earth. And somewhere in the stillness, as he closed his eyes, the wind whispered through the leaves like a promise that even in the depths of solitude, grace was waiting to be found. The years unfolded in silence, one leaf fall after another, until time itself seemed to vanish within the forest that had become his home. Simon Stock, now a man grown thin and worn by solitude, learned to live as the trees lived, rooted, patient, unmoving. The world beyond the woods went on, but to him it became a distant echo, a dream half forgotten. Within the hollow oak, he prayed through dawn and dusk, rising when the first birds sang and kneeling again when darkness spread across the sky. His prayers were not gentle or poetic. They were cries from the depths of a soul stripped bare. Sometimes he pleaded for forgiveness, other times for understanding. But most often he prayed simply to love God more deeply, without the need for comfort or reward. There were days when he thought he could almost hear a reply, not in words, but in the trembling stillness that followed his prayer, as though heaven itself was listening. Food came sparingly, and often through the charity of villagers who, out of curiosity or pity, left bread and herbs at the edge of the forest. They had begun to call him the Hermit of the Tree, half in reverence, half in disbelief. Some said he was touched by grace, others thought him mad. But Simon no longer cared for reputation or reason. The more the world doubted him, the more he found peace in the company of silence. He learned to see divine truth in everything: the morning dew, the sound of wind through branches, the slow decay of fallen leaves. The world, stripped of noise, revealed its holiness to him. Yet solitude is never gentle for long. The same silence that first embraced him now turned into a weight. Nights stretched endlessly, and the mind began to turn against itself. He felt the ache of memories, his mother's smile, the laughter of boys in the village, the flicker of candles in the church where he once knelt as a child. Sometimes he would wake in the darkness and wonder whether he had been abandoned by God. There were moments when despair whispered that he had gone too far, that perhaps holiness was not meant to be found in exile. Still, he refused to leave. When the temptation of escape grew strong, he pressed his hands against the rough bark and whispered a single word: "Stay." Seasons shifted around him like breaths. In spring, wildflowers brightened the forest floor, and Simon took them as signs of resurrection. In summer, he would open his hollow door and let sunlight warm his face, feeling for a moment almost human again. Autumn filled the air with gold, and he would watch the leaves fall, each one a silent homily on surrender. Winter was the hardest, when cold seeped through every crevice, and his body shivered with hunger. But it was in winter that he prayed most fervently. He offered his suffering for the sins of the world, believing that even pain could become a prayer when joined to the cross. At times, travelers stumbled upon him, pilgrims lost in the woods, shepherds seeking strays, or curious boys daring one another to glimpse the holy man. They would find a figure clothed in rough wool, his hair long, his eyes deep with something they could not name. Some asked for his blessing, kneeling awkwardly in the mud. Others fled, frightened by the sight of a man so utterly withdrawn from the world. Simon welcomed all, though his words were few. He would remind them to keep their hearts pure, to forgive, to love the Virgin, to remember that the soul is never truly alone. Then he would return to his prayers, vanishing again into stillness as though he had been part of the forest all along. One day, a young monk from a nearby priory sought him out. The monk had heard tales of the hermit who spoke with angels, though Simon denied such claims. The visitor asked what it was like to live in silence for so many years. Simon looked at him for a long moment before answering softly, "Silence is not empty. It is filled with the voice of God. But first, you must die to all other voices." The monk left in tears, understanding only that this strange man had found something he could not yet comprehend. In his solitude, Simon began to feel that the forest itself had become a kind of monastery. The trees were his brothers, the birds his choir, the wind his chant. He would rise at dawn and bow to the east, facing the rising sun as though before the altar. The hollow oak became a living tabernacle, a dwelling not of wood but of mystery. And within that hidden sanctuary, he began to glimpse truths that cannot be written, only lived. There were moments when his heart seemed to burn with light, when the presence of God surrounded him so completely that he wept from joy. Then there were nights when the light withdrew, and darkness filled him with terror, and he would cling to his faith as one clings to a candle in a storm. Once, after many years, he grew ill. Fever burned through him, and he thought he might die alone in his tree. In his weakness, he prayed not for healing but for acceptance, that his death, like his life, might be hidden in God. Yet he survived. When he awoke, the forest was bright with spring again, and he felt a strange renewal. He realized that the life of a hermit is not a slow death, but a preparation for eternal life. From that day, he no longer feared the solitude. It was no longer exile, but communion. Still, beneath this serenity, a quiet ache remained. For all his peace, Simon longed for the presence of Christ in the Eucharist, for the sacred bread he had once received daily in the chapel of his youth. Without the Mass, his heart felt incomplete. Often he would gaze towards the distant village and imagine the bells of consecration ringing through the air. In those moments, he would lift his hands and whisper, "Lord, come to me, even here." And perhaps heaven heard him, for though no priest came, he felt the same grace descend upon his soul, unseen but undeniable. Years melted into decades. His hair turned white, his hands thin as branches, his voice soft as wind. Few remembered his name now. Fewer still knew his story. He had become a legend, the hermit in the tree, the mad saint, the man who spoke only to God. But in the depths of his heart, Simon knew that his life wasn't wasted. Every prayer, every tear, every hour of silence was a hidden act of love, known only to the one who sees all. And as the forest darkened one evening, Simon sat at the entrance of his hollow, watching the sky fade from gold to gray. He listened to the rustle of leaves, the fading song of a bird, the heartbeat of the earth. For a moment, he thought he heard something else, a whisper, gentle and unmistakable. "Be still, Simon. The time will come." He bowed his head, tears filling his eyes. The years had taught him patience. Whatever God asked of him, he would wait. And so the hermit remained, hidden in the hollow of his tree, a man who had given up the world but gained a secret peace that the world could never take away. The forest grew old around him, and Simon's stock aged with it, his body becoming a part of the woodland, as though bark and bone were kin. The hollow oak that had sheltered him for so many years now seemed to breathe with his prayers. He no longer counted the days or the seasons. His hair had turned the color of frost, and his beard reached his chest, but his eyes remained bright, as if they had learned to hold both heaven and earth in their gaze. In those long hours of solitude, he had come to know the forest as one knows a faithful friend. He understood the voices of the wind, the moods of the sky, and the quiet rhythm of life beneath the soil. He no longer feared the stillness, for he had learned that it was filled not with emptiness, but with presence. And yet beneath that peace, something in him began to stir again. A whisper that his solitude, however holy, was not the end of his pilgrimage, but only its preparation. Sometimes he would hear the distant sound of human voices drifting through the trees, travelers crossing the countryside, or perhaps pilgrims walking toward Canterbury. He would listen, his heart tightening with memories of the world he had left behind. For though he had given up the company of men, he had never ceased to love them. In his prayers, he still carried the sorrows of England, the poor, the sinners, the sick, and the weary. His heart was hidden, but his love was wide as the sky. And as he prayed, he began to sense that God was preparing something he could not yet see. His life had been a long offering of silence, but now, faintly, he felt the weight of a call returning, summoning him from the hollow that had become both cradle and tomb. One night, he dreamed of a great sea, a vast, dark expanse beneath a sky of stars. On its waves drifted a small, weathered ship, carrying men dressed in strange garments of brown and white. Their faces were tired, but their eyes were lifted heavenward. As Simon watched, the sea grew calm, and a voice spoke through the wind, saying, "Go to them." He awoke trembling, unsure if the vision was from God or from the longing of his own heart. But the dream would not leave him. In the days that followed, he prayed for understanding. Each morning he asked the same question, "Lord, what would you have me do?" And each evening, As the light faded through the branches, the same answer seemed to echo within him. Go to them. It was in those days that strangers began to appear at the edge of his solitude, foreign men speaking softly, with accents unlike the English tongue. They wore the rough habits of pilgrims, but bore themselves with quiet dignity. They were the Carmelites, monks from the Holy Land who had fled the violence that had consumed their mountain home. They had once lived in the deserts of Palestine, at the foot of Mount Carmel, praying in imitation of the prophet Elijah. But wars and persecution had driven them westward, across the sea, to the cold and skeptical soil of Europe. They arrived in England poor, uncertain, and unwelcome. Their Eastern customs strange to the established orders of monks who had long claimed the land as their own. Many mocked them as wanderers, others pitied them as relics of a lost crusade. Yet among them burned a quiet devotion, a love of the Virgin Mary, whom they called their Lady of Mount Carmel. When word reached them of an aged hermit who dwelled within a hollow tree, a man whose prayers were said to move even the storms, they sought him out. They found him one misty morning, sitting beside the oak that had sheltered him for decades, his hands folded, his eyes closed in prayer. At first they thought him dead, but when he looked up, there was a gentleness in his face that silenced them. They told him their story, their flight from the East, their struggles in this foreign land, their fear that their order, once aflame with faith, was now dying. Simon listened, saying little. When they had finished, he remained silent for a long time, his gaze lowered to the earth. Then he whispered, almost to himself, "The Lord does not abandon what is his." They asked him to guide them, to help them find their place in this new world. Simon hesitated. He was old. His strength was failing. He had not spoken to men for years except in brief blessings. To leave the forest, to live among others again, seemed impossible. Yet the more he prayed, the clearer the call became. His solitude had not been an escape. It had been a preparation. The years of silence, the nights of hunger, the tears shed unseen, all had been forming him for this moment. At last, he told the brothers he would come. Before he left, he spent one final night within the hollow oak. He knelt on the earth floor and touched the inner walls of the tree, tracing its rough grain with his fingers. The air inside was cool and damp, filled with the scent of moss and thyme. He remembered the day he had first entered, young and trembling, and the countless prayers that had been born in that darkness. "Thank you," he whispered to the tree, as one might to a faithful friend. "You have hidden me well." And then, after a long silence, he added, "But now I must go where obedience calls." When dawn came, he stepped out into the pale light, leaning on a staff. The forest greeted him with the soft murmur of leaves. He turned back once, gazing at the hollow that had been his home, and felt a pang of sorrow. But within that sorrow was peace, for he understood that true obedience to God is not always found in staying still, but in moving when he calls. With slow steps, he followed the Carmelites toward the world of men, leaving behind the only home he had known for decades. The journey to the nearest priory was long and difficult. The roads were muddy, the air heavy with rain, and Simon's body ached with each mile. Yet he walked steadily, his heart lifted by something unseen. The brothers cared for him gently, awed by his endurance. When at last they reached their dwelling, a small, half-ruined house offered by a local benefactor, they gathered around him as if around a living relic. In his humility, Simon refused all honor. He insisted on eating the same coarse bread as they, sleeping on the same hard floor. He was no longer the hermit of the tree, but he had brought the forest's silence with him. And in that silence, something began to change among the brothers. They prayed with new fervor. Their despair lessened. Hope, fragile but real, returned. Yet in the quiet hours of the night, Simon would sometimes sit awake, listening to the wind outside, remembering the whisper of the leaves, and wondering if he had truly done God's will. He missed the forest deeply, the vastness of it, the simplicity. But then he would hear the soft breathing of his brothers, sleeping nearby, and he would know that the same God who had spoken to him in solitude was now speaking through service. And so he prayed, not for comfort, but for strength to guide them well. Thus began a new chapter in Simon Stock's life, a chapter not of hiding, but of bearing the weight of others. He had left the hollow oak behind, yet its spirit went with him. For though the hermit had stepped into the world once more, his soul remained rooted in that sacred silence where heaven first taught him to listen. The small house that the Carmelites had found on English soil was humble, little more than stone and timber huddled against the wind. But to the weary brothers it was a refuge. They had come from far lands, their hearts torn by exile, their minds heavy with the loss of their desert mountain. To them, England was a strange and gray world, a place where rain fell without mercy, and the faith of men felt colder than the sky. They struggled to be understood, to be accepted among the established orders who had long grown comfortable in their wealth and their tradition. Many regarded these newcomers with suspicion. "Who are they?" whispered the townsfolk. "Wanderers who claim to be monks, yet live as beggars." Their prayers were foreign, their chants unfamiliar, their devotion to the Virgin Mary too passionate for the rational tone of the age. And into this fragile company, this trembling order on the verge of extinction, stepped Simon Stock, an old man whose hands trembled from age, but whose soul burned with the fire of long solitude. He did not come as a reformer or a scholar, but as a father. His first act as prior general was not to lecture, but to listen. He walked among his brothers, sat beside them as they mended their sandals or worked in the garden, and asked about their fears. They spoke of ridicule, of hunger, of the constant whisper that their order had no future. To these men, Simon offered not plans, but presence. "Do not look at what the world thinks of you," he told them softly. "Look at what the Mother of God sees in you." His voice carried the quiet authority of one who had lived long in the wilderness, and in that stillness his brothers found courage. Yet even as he spoke peace to others, Simon felt the storm of despair gathering again in his own heart. For though he led the Carmelites, he knew how fragile their place in this new land truly was. Each day brought new trials. The other monastic orders questioned the legitimacy of the Carmelites' way of life. Bishops doubted their origins, kings hesitated to offer protection, and the people often mocked their poverty. Letters from Rome were cold, and some even hinted that the order might be dissolved altogether. Simon read these letters in the candlelight, his hands trembling slightly, and when he finished, he would lower his head in silence. He never showed his sorrow before the younger friars. Only at night, when all slept, would he fall to his knees before the small wooden crucifix that hung in his cell. "Lord," he would whisper, "if it is your will that this order should perish, then let it be. But if there is still a purpose in us, show it. Show me how to lead them." There were no answers, only the sound of the wind pressing against the walls, and the echo of his own heart. He tried to strengthen his brothers in the ways he could. He taught them humility, to embrace poverty as the truest form of freedom. He reminded them that their name, Carmel, meant vineyard, and that even in this cold land, God could make grapes grow in barren soil. He urged them to be gentle, to live as witnesses of peace in a violent age. But the burdens of leadership pressed upon him. He missed the simplicity of the tree, the honesty of its silence. Now his days were filled with decisions and doubts. his prayers interrupted by the needs of others. The solitude that had once been his home now became a memory that comforted and tormented him alike. There were moments when his faith flickered. In the stillness of the chapel, he would stare at the tabernacle and wonder whether he had misunderstood God's call. Had he left his solitude too soon? Was he trying to save an order that heaven had already chosen to let die? He feared that all his years of hidden prayer had prepared him not for triumph, but for failure. Yet, even in those moments, a small flame of trust refused to be extinguished. He remembered the voice he had heard in the forest. "Be still, Simon. The time will come." Perhaps this, too, was part of that time. One evening, as he walked through the cloister after prayer, he overheard two young brothers speaking softly. They were worried that the order would soon be scattered, that their efforts meant nothing. "We are like the last embers of a dying fire," one said. Simon paused, unseen in the shadows. Then he stepped forward, his face lit faintly by the moon. "Do not despise the ember," he said. "It is the ember that carries the memory of the flame." The brothers bowed, moved to silence, and Simon turned away, his own heart trembling. For though his words were meant to comfort them, he realized they were a message to himself. In the months that followed, his health began to falter. The long years of fasting and penance had weakened his body, and his duties as leader left little time for rest. Yet his mind grew sharper in suffering, and his soul seemed to draw closer to something unseen. He began to pray with greater intensity, not for his own salvation, but for the survival of the Carmelites. Often he would kneel through the night, murmuring the Psalms by memory, offering every breath as a plea for mercy. His brothers would find him in the morning, pale and exhausted, yet radiant with a strange serenity. "He prays as though he sees," one whispered, "as though he already stands before heaven." But within Simon's heart, a hidden torment deepened. He feared that his prayers were in vain. He saw the order shrinking, the brothers leaving, and he felt the old loneliness return, not the holy solitude of the forest, but the desolation of one who cannot see the fruit of his labor. One night, unable to sleep, he walked outside into the dark garden. The air was cold, and a thin mist clung to the ground. He looked up at the stars and spoke aloud, "Lord, you once called me out of silence. Now I ask only this: if this order is yours, give me a sign. Not for me, but for them, for these sons who have given all they have. Do not let their faith die in the dark." He waited, but no voice came. Only the faint rustle of leaves, like the breath of his old forest. He smiled sadly, thinking that perhaps that was answer enough, the quiet reminder that God's silence is not absence, but mystery. Still, the prayer left his soul trembling. He knew he was reaching the limits of his strength. If salvation for his order was to come, it would not be through his own efforts. It would have to come from heaven itself. In the days that followed, Simon spoke little. He went about his duties with the calm of one who has surrendered everything. Yet those who looked into his eyes saw that they were filled with expectation, as though he waited for something unseen. The other friars did not understand, but they felt the atmosphere around him begin to change. A stillness that was almost luminous, a peace that seemed to breathe through him. Some whispered that the old hermit was nearing sanctity. Others said he was fading into another world. And in truth, Simon Stock was standing at the edge of revelation. For in the depths of his quiet despair, a vision was drawing near. One that would not only answer his prayer, but would change the destiny of his order forever. The world had mocked him as the hermit in the tree, the man of foolish devotion. But soon, the hollow of his heart, emptied by suffering and love, would become the vessel of a miracle that would reach across centuries. Night had fallen over the priory, soft and windless, and the narrow cloister lay washed in the silver of the moon. The brothers had gone to rest, their chanting voices fading into silence. But Simon Stock remained alone in the chapel. He had knelt there since Vespers, his body weakened by fasting, his soul pressed by sorrow. The candles burned low, their light trembling on the worn stone floor. In the stillness, he whispered the words of the psalm he loved most. "Out of the depths I have cried unto thee, O Lord." Each syllable trembled as it left his lips, for he felt that he truly was in the depths of human weariness, the depths of faith stripped bare. The order he led was falling apart. Their numbers dwindled, their support vanished, and he saw no earthly hope left. Yet he prayed, not with the fervor of triumph, but with the desperation of one who has nothing left to lose. "If you will not save us, Lord," he murmured, "then let us perish still loving you." His body shook as the night grew colder. A pain like fire burned through his chest, yet he refused to leave his knees. He closed his eyes and allowed his mind to sink back into the forest of his youth, into that hollow oak where he had once spoken with God in silence. In memory, he felt the rough bark beneath his hands again, heard the whispering wind, saw the soft flicker of starlight through the leaves. It was there, in solitude, that he had learned to wait without knowing. And now, as an old man, he waited again. His lips moved soundlessly. He prayed for his brothers, for their courage, for their faith. He prayed for the Virgin Mary, whom he had loved since childhood, to intercede. "Mother," he whispered, "I have no strength left. You who are the hope of the hopeless, remember your children. We are drowning. Save us." The air seemed to grow heavy then, not in dread, but in presence. The chapel, once dim and lifeless, seemed to breathe. Simon's eyes fluttered open, and though the candles still burned, another light began to fill the space, soft at first, then deep and living, as though the dawn itself had come inside the walls. His heart beat painfully. He thought he was dying, but the fear passed quickly, replaced by awe. The light gathered near the altar, forming not a flame but a radiance shaped by love. And in that brightness he saw her, the Virgin Mary, clothed not in splendor but in gentle simplicity. She stood as though she had stepped down from heaven itself, her mantle wide, her face serene, her eyes filled with compassion deeper than words. In her hands she held a small brown garment, plain as the earth. Simon fell forward, his forehead touching the stone. His voice broke into a sob. "Mother, what is this?" he whispered. She spoke, and her words were like music, not sound, but meaning woven into light. "Beloved son," she said, "this is my gift to you and to all my children of Carmel. Take it, and through it you shall have my protection. This shall be the sign of my love, that whoever dies clothed in this shall not suffer eternal fire. It shall be a garment of grace, a shield of mercy, a bond between heaven and those who wear it in faith." He dared to lift his eyes, trembling. The brown scapular rested in her hands, two small pieces of cloth joined by cords, simple and unadorned. It looked like nothing, and yet in that moment Simon saw what it was. A covenant. The same humility that had marked her son now shone in this gift, a symbol of love hidden in simplicity. The Mother of God smiled gently, and as she placed the scapular into his hands, the light surrounded him. The air was filled with fragrance, not of flowers, but of purity itself. For a moment, all pain left his body. He was neither young nor old, but utterly still, suspended in grace. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the vision began to fade. The light withdrew, the scent vanished, and the cold air of the chapel returned. Simon found himself kneeling in the dim glow of dying candles, the scapular lying across his palms. He remained motionless for a long time. His tears fell silently, tracing the lines of his weathered face. He did not doubt what had happened. His heart knew. The Mother of Christ had come to him, and through his unworthy hands, she had given hope to her sons. He pressed the small garment to his lips and whispered, "Fiat." Then, gathering what strength remained, he rose and carried it toward the brothers' dormitory. When dawn came, the Carmelites awoke to find their prior already waiting in the courtyard. His face was pale but radiant, his eyes shining with quiet fire. He gathered them around him, and though his voice was weak, it carried through the morning air. "My sons," he said, "last night Our Lady came to me. She has given us a sign of her favor, a pledge that she will never abandon those who serve her faithfully. This," he said, holding up the small scapular, "is her gift." The brothers stared in wonder. Some wept, others knelt. Simon told them every word she had spoken, not adding or subtracting a syllable. Then he placed the first scapular upon the shoulders of a young friar, saying, "Receive this sign of her protection, and may you die in her peace." The friar bowed his head, trembling, as though clothed in heaven itself. In the days that followed, word of the vision spread quietly through the order. The story reached beyond the priory walls, carried by pilgrims and priests. Many doubted it at first. How could such a humble man receive such a great promise? But others believed. They saw the peace that had come over Simon, the renewed strength in the Carmelites' prayers, the hope returning to a once dying community. Soon, the scapular became more than a piece of cloth. It became a living symbol of trust, of consecration, of belonging to Mary. Where despair had ruled, joy began to blossom. The friars who had once feared extinction now spoke with conviction, saying, "We are the brothers of Our Lady's garment." Simon himself spoke little of the vision thereafter. He forbade his brothers to speak of him as a prophet or seer. "I am nothing," he said quietly. "She is everything." Yet those who saw him could not mistake the transformation. His step, though slow, had regained strength. His voice carried a peace that silenced all fear. In his cell, he kept the scapular folded beside the crucifix, and each night before sleeping, he would touch it reverently and whisper, "O Mother, keep your promise." Sometimes, alone in the chapel, he would think back to the years in the hollow oak, to the long nights of cold and hunger, and he would understand at last why God had called him there. All the solitude, the pain, the darkness, it had been preparing him for this single hour of revelation. The hermit who once fled from men had become the bearer of a gift for the whole world. And he felt no pride, only wonder that heaven had chosen such a poor vessel for so great a mercy. Outside, life continued as before. The seasons turned, and the brothers worked and prayed. But within the heart of the order, something irrevocable had changed. The scapular was worn not as ornament but as reminder that suffering accepted in faith becomes salvation, that humility draws down heaven, and that love, when pure, can never be forgotten. And Simon, now nearing the twilight of his years, understood that his journey was nearly done. Yet he felt no fear, for the same mother who had visited him in his loneliness would surely come again, to guide him from this world into the next. The years that followed the vision unfolded with a calm and luminous simplicity, as though the entire world around Simon Stock had begun to breathe differently. The small priory that once trembled on the edge of collapse slowly filled with a quiet, steady life. Pilgrims began to come from distant towns, drawn not by spectacle or miracles, but by the calm certainty that dwelled in the faces of the Carmelites. Their reputation spread not through proclamation, but through peace. Wherever they went, they carried the little brown scapular, two small patches of cloth bound by cords, and with it a message of mercy that was neither grand nor complicated, that God's mother would not abandon her children. In the growing tumult of medieval England, amid wars and famines, that promise was like the whisper of spring after a long winter. Simon watched this transformation with deep gratitude, but never with pride. He would often tell his brothers that the scapular was not a magic charm, nor a guarantee of comfort, but a sign, a reminder to live under Mary's mantle, to walk in humility and trust. "It is not the cloth that saves," he told them one evening as they sat together by candlelight, "but the love that it represents. The scapular means belonging. It means saying yes to her as she once said yes to God." The brothers nodded, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of the flame. Many of them had never known him before the vision, but all felt that they were in the presence of someone whose soul had already crossed into the quiet light of heaven. Still, Simon's path was not without shadows. With the growing fame of the scapular came envy, skepticism, and misunderstanding. Some priests denounced it as superstition, claiming that salvation could not be tied to a piece of cloth. Others accused the Carmelites of inventing the story to gain favor or followers. Letters were sent from churchmen demanding proof, testimonies, explanations. Simon responded to none of them with anger. Instead, he wrote a simple letter to the Pope, humbly recounting what had occurred, affirming his obedience to the Church, and leaving the rest in God's hands. "If it is false," he wrote, "may it be forgotten. But if it is true, it will bear fruit by itself." He sealed the letter, prayed over it, and sent it away. Then he returned to his prayers as before, content to let heaven defend its own work. The doubts and criticism pained some of the younger friars, but Simon consoled them with gentleness. "My sons," he said, "truth is patient. The cross was doubted too until it became the hope of the world. So shall this promise be. Do not fight for it with words. Live it." And so they did. They went out to the poor, teaching them to wear the scapular as a sign of trust in the Virgin's intercession. They preached mercy rather than fear, gentleness rather than condemnation. Slowly, hearts softened. Those who had once mocked the Carmelites began to seek their prayers. Those who had doubted the vision began to whisper of its beauty. For Simon himself, the years after the vision were ones of deep interior stillness. He felt the nearness of the Virgin as one might feel sunlight through closed eyes. He no longer prayed as one begging for favor, but as one who had found peace in surrender. Often he would spend hours in the chapel, saying nothing, merely resting in the awareness that God was near. His body had grown frail, age had curved his back and thinned his voice, yet his presence carried a quiet strength that even the youngest brothers felt in their bones. He had become, in his final years, like the tree that once sheltered him. Rooted, silent, steadfast. There were times when he would ask to be taken outside to the garden, where he would sit in the shade of the apple trees and listen to the hum of bees. The brothers would see him there, his face turned slightly upward, his lips moving in prayer, and though they could not hear the words, they sensed that he was speaking to the mother who had once descended into his darkness. He spoke to her now as one speaks to a dear friend, without fear, without formality, with the tender ease of trust. "You kept your word," he would murmur, "and so will I keep mine." Despite his humility, Simon was sought by many who wished to see him before he died. Nobles, priests, and even bishops traveled to the priory to meet the old hermit who had spoken with the Virgin. Some came seeking miracles, others counsel. He received them all with equal warmth. When they asked him for advice, he would always return to the same theme: humility. "The great danger of the soul," he would say, "is not sin, for sin can be forgiven. It is pride, for pride closes the heart to grace. Mary was without sin because she was without pride. If you wish to belong to her, be small." These words, spoken softly, lingered in the hearts of those who heard them long after they departed. As time went on, Simon withdrew more from the daily affairs of leadership. Younger, stronger men took up the administrative burdens, but he remained their spiritual center. When disagreements arose, he was called upon to mediate, and his very presence calmed tempers. The brothers often remarked that when he entered a room, it felt as though the air itself grew still, as if the Holy Spirit moved quietly through him. He would only smile when they said such things. "Do not look at me," he would reply. "Look at what God does through weakness. I am only an echo." His final years were marked by simplicity. He ate little, slept little, and spoke less. The world outside continued to change. Kings waged wars, cities grew, the church wrestled with its own conflicts, but none of these things disturbed his peace. The scapular devotion continued to spread, not through propaganda, but through quiet witness. Families wore it, sailors carried it on long voyages, the dying clutched it as they passed into eternity. Wherever it went, hearts found comfort in the thought that Mary herself had given a promise of hope. One winter evening, Simon sat in his cell beside a small fire. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and candle wax. He held the scapular in his hands and reflected on the path his life had taken. From the boy who prayed in the quiet fields of Kent, to the hermit who dwelled in a tree, to the old friar now nearing death, every chapter he saw had been guided by the same unseen hand. He thought of how he had once begged for meaning in his suffering, and how that meaning had been revealed only when he stopped seeking it for himself. "All along," he whispered, "it was you." Tears filled his eyes, but they were not of sadness. They were of recognition. He lifted the scapular to his lips one last time and said, "Mother, let me die as I have lived, in your care." Then, as the fire dimmed and the shadows lengthened, he closed his eyes. The brothers who found him the next morning said he looked as though he were asleep, his face serene, the small brown scapular resting on his chest. A faint smile lingered on his lips, as if he were hearing a voice that no one else could hear. They buried him within the monastery grounds, and above his grave they carved a simple inscription: "He trusted and was not confounded." In the years after his death, the story of the vision and the promise of the scapular spread throughout Christendom. Popes blessed it, saints wore it, and generations found comfort in the humble garment that had come from one man's long agony and one woman's mercy. The hermit who had once hidden in a hollow tree became a bridge between heaven and earth, his solitude transformed into a legacy of hope. And in the quiet of the English countryside, when the wind passes through the trees, it is said that one can still hear a faint whisper, not of sorrow, but of peace, the echo of Simon Stock's prayer that heaven heard and answered. In the gentle aftermath of Simon Stock's death, the Carmelites moved through their grief as one might move through mist, slowly, quietly, with reverence. The brothers who had loved him gathered each evening in the chapel to pray for his soul, though in their hearts they already believed he needed no such aid. His presence, even in absence, seemed to linger in every corner of the monastery, in the soft murmur of the psalms, in the flicker of candlelight upon the altar, and in the silence that followed their prayers. The cell where he had spent his last days became a place of pilgrimage, not out of superstition, but out of gratitude. His worn sandals, his simple wooden crucifix, and the small brown scapular folded neatly beside it were treated with tenderness, as relics of a life consumed by love. Outside, spring began to unfold once more, the fields greening, the air scented with rain, and the brothers took it as a quiet sign that heaven had accepted their father's offering. For a time, the world outside knew little of Simon Stock's passing. England was restless again, torn between kings and barons, and news of an old friar's death stirred little interest beyond the cloister. But within a few years, the story of his vision began to travel beyond those stone walls. The brothers who had once feared extinction now carried the message of the scapular to parishes and marketplaces, to distant monasteries and noble halls. They did not speak of miracles with pride, but of mercy with humility. They told of a hermit who had once lived in a tree, who had prayed not for glory, but for the survival of his brothers, and of how the Mother of God had answered him with a garment of grace. People listened, the poor, the sick, the weary, and something in their hearts stirred. It was not merely the promise of protection that moved them, but the tenderness of the story itself, that heaven had chosen to speak to a forgotten man, hidden and alone, and had lifted through him a whole order from despair. Soon, the Brown Scapular began to appear far from England. Merchants carried it across the Channel into France. Monks brought it to Ireland, Spain, and Italy. Wherever it went, devotion followed. To wear the scapular became an act of quiet faith, a way of saying, "I belong to her." The humble cloth was not the mark of privilege, but of surrender. It reminded those who wore it that holiness is not a matter of grand deeds, but of daily trust, of small fidelities that endure through darkness. The Carmelites themselves grew again in number and in spirit. Their monasteries multiplied, their voices joined in new hymns of thanksgiving, and the once forgotten order became a living witness to the gentleness of divine providence. In the midst of this renewal, stories began to arise, stories whispered among the faithful and recorded by monks with trembling hands. Sailors caught in storms who called upon Our Lady of Mount Carmel while clutching the scapular and found the sea miraculously calmed. Soldiers struck down on the battlefield who were found wearing the small brown cloth and, against all odds, survived. Mothers who prayed for their children, placing the scapular upon their tiny shoulders, and found peace in their hearts, even amid loss. These stories spread like threads of light through the fabric of Christendom, each one adding to the quiet wonder surrounding Simon's name. Yet the Carmelites never sought to glorify the tales. They reminded the faithful that the scapular wasn't a shield against suffering, but a sign that suffering itself could be transfigured through love. Years turned into decades, and the century changed. Simon's body, resting beneath the monastery chapel, became a place of pilgrimage. Those who came to kneel by his grave often left with tears upon their faces, not from sorrow, but from an overwhelming sense of peace. His story became part of England's sacred memory, told by priests in homilies, sung by monks in their vigils. Children learned his name beside that of Saint Dominic and Saint Francis. Yet among the Carmelites themselves, he was remembered not as a miracle worker, but as the gentle father who had taught them how to hope when all seemed lost. His example shaped the soul of the order, that faith must be rooted in silence, that leadership must be born of humility, and that every life, no matter how hidden, can become a vessel of grace. It was said that one of his disciples, an old brother who had served him in his final years, once dreamt of seeing Simon standing beneath a great tree, its branches spreading over the earth. From those branches hung countless scapulars, fluttering in the breeze like leaves, and beneath each one stood a soul sheltered in light. When the brother awoke, he wept, for he knew that the hermit's secret, the secret of love found in loneliness, had become the shelter of millions. Centuries later, long after Simon's name had passed from history books and the wars of men had reshaped the world, the promise of the scapular endured. Saints and popes would wear it. Countless ordinary believers would die clutching it, trusting in the same mercy that had visited a poor hermit in his darkness. The Church would one day confirm his vision as authentic, honoring him not merely for the miracle, but for the life that made such a miracle possible. The simplicity of the garment remained unchanged, the same rough brown cloth, the same cords, as though time itself bowed before its humility. Even as art and architecture grew more elaborate, the scapular retained its quiet poverty, a reminder that heaven's most radiant gifts often come wrapped in plainness. In the Carmelite houses that flourished across Europe, the brothers would often speak of Simon as though he were still among them. His rule of prayer and silence continued to guide their days. Each morning, as they fastened the scapular over their shoulders, they would recall his words, "Do not look for greatness, but for grace." His story became a living parable, told to novices on their first night in the monastery, so that they might understand that sanctity is not measured by recognition, but by surrender. And beyond the monasteries, the devotion reached even the humblest homes. Farmers, widows, children, all took comfort in the idea that they, too, could wear something that linked them to heaven. The scapular became the quiet companion of the sick and the dying, the unseen sign of faith in the everyday struggles of life. When plague came, people wore it as they tended to the afflicted. When war swept through Europe, soldiers placed it beneath their armor. When peace returned, it hung once more by the bedside of newborns. Through centuries of change, the small piece of cloth whispered the same truth, that divine mercy does not abandon those who entrust themselves to it. In time, even the forest that had once sheltered Simon disappeared. The great oak rotted away, leaving only legend. Yet the spirit of that hollow tree lived on, in monasteries, in churches, in the hidden corners of countless hearts. The solitude that had shaped one man's soul became a spiritual heritage for the world. For every person who ever felt forgotten, every believer who prayed in darkness, every heart that trembled under the weight of silence, Simon's story offered reassurance that no prayer is ever wasted, no suffering unseen. The hermit's secret had become humanity's consolation. And so, though centuries would pass, and the language of the Church would change, his life remained a whisper across time, a story of one man's surrender that grew into the world's hope. The Carmelite brothers continued to tell it at night, by the dim glow of their lamps, as the wind moved softly through the cloister. "Once there was a man who lived in a tree," they would begin, and the listener would know that what followed was not merely history, but mystery. The mystery of how a soul's greatest loneliness can become the birthplace of divine love. Time, like a patient tide, carried Simon Stock's legacy beyond the shores he had known, and with every generation, the story of the scapular grew deeper roots within the heart of Christendom. In the centuries following his death, the Carmelite order transformed from a struggling remnant of exiles into one of the Church's great pillars of contemplation and devotion. Monasteries rose across Europe, from the misted valleys of Ireland to the golden plains of Spain, and everywhere the same simple sign was seen, the brown scapular resting over the hearts of monks, nuns, and lay faithful alike. It became a quiet thread binding them to the same promise, to the same humility, to the same unseen grace. The world had changed, kingdoms had risen and fallen, languages evolved, Empires expanded and dissolved. Yet this small piece of cloth endured, carrying with it a whisper from the 13th century, that heaven remembers the lowly, and that love born of suffering never fades. In England, however, Simon's homeland grew cold to the Church. The Reformation swept across the island like a fierce wind, tearing monasteries apart, silencing bells that had once called generations to prayer. The Carmelites were driven from their houses, their libraries burned, their chapels desecrated. Yet even in persecution, the scapular lived on, passed from hand to hand in secret, worn beneath garments by those who still believed. Many Catholics in those dark years died with it against their skin, a final act of fidelity to Mary's promise. The name of Simon Stock was rarely spoken aloud. To do so could bring suspicion or death. But in whispered prayers he was remembered as the hermit whose faith no power could extinguish. His story became a hidden fire, glowing in silence until the light could return. And return it did. When at last the Church was free again, and monasteries began to rise anew, the devotion to Our Lady of Mount Carmel bloomed as though watered by centuries of tears. Pilgrims journeyed once more to Kent, seeking the land where Simon had been born, and where, legend said, the hollow oak once stood. There was no trace of it left, only fields and hedgerows. But those who came there prayed nonetheless, knowing that grace leaves its mark not in wood or stone, but in the invisible soil of memory. Artists began to paint the scene of his vision, the old friar kneeling before the Virgin, her mantle spread wide, the scapular shining softly in her hands. Each painting differed in color and form, but all shared the same stillness, that sacred pause when heaven bends down to meet the sorrow of earth. It was not only monks who carried his legacy now. The scapular had become the devotion of the people, of sailors crossing unknown seas, of mothers praying for their children, of the poor who found in it a sense of dignity that no misfortune could take away. It crossed oceans with explorers, was worn in battles, and found its way into every corner of the Catholic world. In times of plague, it hung over the sickbed as a sign of hope. In times of peace, it was given to newborns as their first garment of grace. Its brown color, plain as earth, reminded the faithful that holiness is born not from splendor, but from humility. Even the great saints, Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, Thérèse of Lisieux, would wear it, cherishing it as the emblem of a family of souls bound by prayer and love. Through them, Simon's spirit lived on, the same flame of interior silence, the same surrender, the same boundless trust in the mother who never forgets her children. But with devotion came the risk of forgetting the man behind the promise. Many spoke of the scapular, but few remembered the hermit who had wept in his tree, who had known the agony of despair and the sweetness of divine consolation. To correct this, the Carmelites began to write his story anew, preserving it in chronicles and manuscripts. They wrote of his early years in Kent, of his solitude, his leadership, his vision. These accounts, though simple, breathed reverence. They did not seek to magnify his greatness, but to preserve his humanity, to remind the world that holiness is rarely born in comfort, but in the hidden crucible of surrender. And as these stories spread, Simon's life became a mirror in which the weary could see themselves. For every man or woman who felt unseen, forgotten, or burdened by the world, his story whispered that God works in silence, that grace grows in places where no one thinks to look. It told them that prayer, even when it feels unanswered, shapes eternity in ways the soul cannot yet perceive. In this way, Simon Stock became not only a saint of the scapular, but a saint of perseverance, a living testimony to the truth that the seed of faith must fall into darkness before it can bloom. Centuries passed, and his name was spoken in every language of the Church. The popes themselves would speak of him with affection. Some issued formal recognition of the scapular's promise. Others renewed its devotion in times of need. It became customary for the faithful to be enrolled in the scapular, a ceremony as humble as the garment itself. A simple blessing, a prayer, and the placing of the brown cloth upon the shoulders. For many, it was a turning point in life, a moment of belonging. To wear it was to accept the invitation of Mary to live under her protection, to see in her purity a reflection of what humanity could still become. There were those who questioned the promise, theologians who wrestled with the mystery of grace, who asked how salvation could be tied to such a small sign. But even they, when they met the people who wore it, could not deny the faith it inspired. The scapular was never meant to be understood only with the mind, it spoke to the heart. It was the gospel in thread and cloth, the mystery of incarnation woven into something tangible. It was a reminder that divine love doesn't float above human life, but enters into its simplest gestures, into the act of clothing oneself each morning, of enduring hardship with hope, of dying with peace. In one account from the 17th century, a Carmelite preacher stood before a crowd and said, "The scapular is not the treasure itself. It is the key that reminds us there is a treasure." And though he spoke long after Simon Stock's death, his words echoed the old friar's heart. The scapular was never about power. It was about presence, the enduring nearness of the mother who had come once to the hermit's cell, and who now came daily to countless souls in their need. In every age, the world seemed to grow darker, and yet this quiet devotion endured, like a small flame that refused to die. During wars and revolutions, during persecutions and plagues, the faithful continued to wear the scapular, to teach their children about the promise of Carmel. And in that act, so small, so personal, Simon Stock lived again. His body had returned to dust, his forest long forgotten, yet his spirit breathed through the centuries, whispering to each generation the same truth he had learned beneath the branches of his tree, that no heart surrendered to God is ever wasted, that no suffering offered in love is ever lost. If one were to stand today among the ruins of that ancient countryside in Kent, one might see nothing of him. No shrine, no monument, only the wind moving through the grass. But if one listens, truly listens, there is still a sense of presence there. The silence that once held his prayer still lingers, patient and tender. It speaks not in words, but in a still, small voice. The same voice that once called to him in the forest, the voice that now calls to all who seek peace in a restless world. And perhaps that is the truest miracle of all, that a man who chose to disappear into solitude has, through the grace of God and the mercy of Mary, never been forgotten. There is a moment in the history of every devotion when it ceases to belong to a single people or a single century, and becomes instead the quiet inheritance of the whole Church. Such was the destiny of the Brown Scapular that had been born from the anguish and prayer of Simon Stock. As the centuries turned, and the old feudal world gave way to new empires and then to nations, the small, humble garment remained unchanged. When cathedrals crumbled, when monasteries fell to ruin, when the voices of faith were silenced by the noise of progress, still there were always hearts that turned to Mary through that ancient sign. The scapular did not shout its presence into history. It whispered. And in that whisper, countless souls found a peace that no empire could destroy. The Carmelites, scattered by persecution and war, carried the devotion wherever they went. They crossed oceans with explorers and missionaries, bringing the promise of Mount Carmel to new continents. In the humid jungles of the New World, among the frozen plains of the North, and in the crowded streets of growing cities, the same brown scapular rested upon the shoulders of the faithful. It became a bridge between the cloister and the world, between the peasant and the noble, between the lonely and the beloved. In every language, it spoke the same message, that the Virgin's protection is constant, that those who wear her sign walk beneath her gaze. It was as though the quiet promise given to an old English hermit had rippled outward through the ages, touching shore after shore, heart after heart, until the entire church breathed with it. And yet, as its reach grew, the world's understanding of the scapular deepened. Theologians and mystics began to see in it more than a symbol of protection. They saw an invitation to transformation. To wear the scapular was not merely to claim safety, but to accept a way of life, to live as Mary lived, in continual openness to the will of God. The Carmelite teachers would say that the scapular is a habit, and every habit signifies belonging. Whoever puts it on, they said, must seek to wear not only its cloth, but its spirit, humility, purity, and trust. Thus, Simon Stock's legacy became not a superstition, but a school of sanctity, a daily call to simplicity and surrender. Among those who understood this most deeply was a quiet young woman born centuries later in France, Thérèse of Lisieux, the Little Flower. In her brief life, she embraced the Carmelite vocation with the same passion that had once burned in Simon's heart. She wore the brown scapular from childhood and cherished it as a sign of belonging to the Virgin's family. "It is the gentle chain," she once wrote, "that binds me to my mother." For her, as for so many, the scapular was not an ornament but a vow, the daily reminder that love is measured not in great deeds but in small, faithful acts. In this way, the vision given to a hermit in medieval England found its echo in the heart of a young nun in modern France, and through her it reached into the age of modernity with fresh power. But the scapular's story was not only one of saints, it was also one of ordinary souls whose faith remained unseen by history. There were farmers who wore it as they tilled the soil, whispering prayers to the Virgin with each furrow. There were mothers who fastened it around their children's necks before they left for war. There were sailors who tied it beneath their uniforms, trusting it to keep their courage firm against the waves. There were prisoners who clung to it in the darkness of their cells, drawing strength from the thought that the Mother of God knelt beside them in their suffering. And there were the dying, the countless men and women who felt the scapular's soft cloth against their hearts as they breathed their last, leaving the world in the quiet hope that Mary's promise would prove true. Through all this, Simon Stock's name persisted like a thread of gold woven through time. The Carmelites continued to celebrate his feast each year with simplicity and gratitude, recalling not only his vision, but the long years of solitude that had prepared him for it. In sermons and stories, he became a symbol of perseverance, a man who waited in faith when all seemed lost. They spoke of him not as one who had seen heaven with his eyes, but as one who had trusted heaven without seeing. This, they said, was the heart of Carmel, to wait, to trust, to love in silence. The world grew louder, busier, and less inclined to silence, yet even in the modern age, the brown scapular remained strangely timeless. During the wars of the 20th century, it was found again on the shoulders of soldiers, nurses, and refugees. Priests distributed thousands of them to the faithful who sought comfort amid the terror of bombs and the chaos of flight. One chaplain wrote in his journal that as he heard confessions in the trenches, he would see the brown cords peeking from beneath the men's tunics, and he would think of Simon Stock praying in his hollow tree. The same faith, the same hope, the same fragile courage. It comforted him to know that what began in the loneliness of one man's suffering had become a bond of strength for millions. Even the popes spoke of it with reverence. Pope Pius XI, in the middle of the 20th century, called the scapular a sign of consecration to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, and he urged all the faithful to wear it as a reminder of their baptismal promise. Others after him repeated the same counsel. The Church, in her wisdom, never exalted the scapular as a guarantee of salvation, but always upheld it as a sign of commitment, a sacramental of mercy. To receive it was to be reminded that holiness begins not in perfection, but in belonging, that to be covered by Mary's mantle is to be invited into her humility and her courage. And so, across generations and continents, Simon's secret, the secret born in sorrow and silence, became one of the Church's most beloved treasures. Yet perhaps the truest continuation of his story is not in churches or ceremonies, but in the unseen moments when faith flickers quietly in ordinary lives. A child's whispered prayer at night, a widow's rosary beside her window, a worker pausing in the fields to cross himself at the sound of the Angelus. These are the living echoes of the hermit in the tree. The world rarely notices them, but heaven does. In this way, Simon Stock's life continues to speak, not through grandeur, but through gentleness. His voice comes not from pulpits, but from silence. It reminds every soul that sanctity is not about fleeing the world, but about finding God within it, even within pain, even within fear, even within the smallest act of trust. The scapular, that humble garment, is nothing less than the world's quiet invitation to remember that love alone endures. And perhaps, when all is said and done, this is what Simon Stock's vision truly meant: that the same God who once entered human history in the smallness of a child continues to enter our lives in simple forms, in bread, in water, in cloth, in prayer, drawing eternity into the fabric of the everyday. His hollow tree is long gone, but in every heart that turns to the Virgin in trust, the same miracle happens again. The exile finds home, the lonely find company, and the suffering find that their wounds, like his, can become the doors through which grace descends. The centuries rolled forward like a slow river, carrying with them empires, inventions, and endless change. Yet through all of history's noise, the quiet devotion of the Brown Scapular remained. It was not the kind of story that filled chronicles or moved armies, but it endured in the silence of ordinary lives, passed from parent to child, from priest to penitent, from sailor to pilgrim. What had begun in the hollow of a tree had become a living current of faith that wound through the heart of the Church like a hidden spring. Its power lay not in grandeur, but in constancy, the way it survived without demanding attention, the way it gathered meaning through generations who never forgot the promise of the Virgin to Simon Stock. In the age of kings, it was worn beneath silks and armor. In the age of factories and machines, it was tucked quietly beneath coarse shirts and uniforms. It remained the same: 2 scraps of brown cloth, a thread of simplicity holding the world's weary souls together beneath Mary's mantle. In the 19th century, when modernity was still young and the world began to believe that faith belonged only to the past, the Carmelites renewed their mission. They reminded the faithful that the scapular was not a relic but a living sign, a call to remember, in an age of progress, that divine mercy still walked beside humanity. Missionaries carried it into every continent. Across the mountains of South America, through the streets of India, into the islands of the Pacific, the same image reappeared. the Virgin of Mount Carmel holding her child and extending the scapular to humankind. In villages without churches, in places where priests came only once a year, the small brown cloth became the people's altar, their tangible assurance that heaven was near. For the poor and forgotten, it meant they, too, were seen. There is something profoundly human in the way devotion endures even when belief is challenged. People who could not explain the theology of sacraments or dogma still understood the tenderness of a mother's promise. The scapular, like a mother's hand resting on the shoulder, required no words. It simply said, "You are mine." And so, in that century of revolutions and doubts, of cities rising and faiths questioned, the scapular endured not as argument but as presence. It offered comfort in sickness, courage in death, and purpose in daily labor. The men who wore it while toiling in mines, the women who wore it while nursing their infants, the soldiers who wore it as they marched into battle, all carried with them a link to something beyond sight, to a love older and deeper than the world's turmoil. Amid this renewal, stories again began to circulate of miracles and deliverances, not to provoke wonder, but to awaken faith. In one account, a priest in France told of a village where cholera had struck without mercy. The people, in fear, turned to Our Lady of Mount Carmel and placed the scapular around the necks of the sick. To the astonishment of all, the plague ceased. Whether miracle or mercy, the villagers never doubted that the Virgin had kept her promise. In another tale, a ship caught in a storm off the coast of Spain was saved when its captain, remembering the old legend, cast his scapular into the raging sea and prayed aloud for help. The winds calmed, and the sailors wept for joy, not from superstition but from gratitude. For them, the scapular was not a talisman, but a sign that heaven listens to human fear. Through such stories, Simon Stock's name began to return once more to the tongues of the faithful. His image, long faded from memory, was painted again. The frail old friar kneeling in the light of the Virgin, his hands outstretched in wonder as she places the scapular in his grasp. In cathedrals and humble chapels alike, his statue appeared beside hers, the Hermit of Kent standing forever at her feet, his eyes lifted in quiet adoration. For many, he came to symbolize the perseverance of hope. The man who prayed when all seemed lost, who waited in darkness and found light. He had not been a theologian, nor a preacher of eloquence. He had been a soul who refused to stop believing. And in this, his story spoke deeply to the modern age, which often knew progress, but not peace. In time, devotion to the Brown Scapular became woven into the rhythm of Catholic life. The Church, discerning its fruit, blessed it with indulgences, prayers, and feast days. On the 16th of July each year, the feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel was celebrated with joy, not only in monasteries, but in the homes of ordinary believers. Processions filled the streets with hymns and incense, and children crowned with flowers carried banners of the Virgin, their small voices joining in the ancient refrain, "Flos Carmeli, flower of Carmel, splendor of heaven." It was a song older than memory, said to have been first sung by the earliest Carmelites on the slopes of the Holy Mountain. And though the centuries had altered the world beyond recognition, that song still echoed through the Church like the heartbeat of an unbroken lineage, the voice of a family that stretched across time and continents, born from the solitude of one man's prayer. And yet, in the midst of this flourishing devotion, the deeper meaning of Simon's story was never lost. The Carmelites continued to teach that the scapular, while precious, was not an end but a beginning, that it called the wearer to interior conversion, to a life of silent love and constant presence, To wear the scapular without striving for virtue, they said, was to wear a symbol without its soul. The true disciple of Carmel was not merely protected by Mary, but transformed by her example, her patience, her purity, her courage to believe even when she could not understand. In this teaching, the life of Simon Stock was the perfect model. His years in the hollow tree had not been escape, but preparation, a long dying to himself so that the life of God could dwell in him. Every soul who took the scapular upon their shoulders was invited to that same journey, to become, in the quiet of their own life, another hermit of the heart. In monasteries from Europe to Asia, the Carmelites would often end their evening prayers with a reading from Simon's life, a reminder that suffering, when offered in trust, can bear fruit beyond imagination. The younger brothers, hearing the story of the hermit and the virgin, would sometimes weep without knowing why. Perhaps they recognized in it the truth that every heart yearns to hear, that nothing given to God is ever wasted. And as the candles dimmed and silence descended, they would whisper the final words of their ancient hymn, "Mother and ornament of Carmel, watch over us." Outside the cloister, the world continued its restless motion. New ideologies arose, new inventions promised salvation, and faith was again tested. But through it all, the brown scapular endured, carried in secret beneath the clothes of millions. It was the Church's heartbeat of hope, the quiet assurance that love is stronger than history. For those who believed, it remained a bridge between earth and heaven, between struggle and peace, between fear and trust. And if, in some forgotten corner of Kent, one were to stand beneath the sky at dusk and listen to the wind through the trees, perhaps they might imagine they hear it still. That gentle breath of prayer that once rose from a hermit's heart, still carried by time, still alive in the faith of those who wear the humble sign. The world may forget the names of its saints, but heaven does not. And the echo of Simon Stock's devotion continues, like a fragrance after rain, reminding every generation that divine promises, once given, are never withdrawn. As centuries continued their unbroken march, the name of St. Simon Stock took on the air of legend, yet his story remained quietly alive, humming beneath the surface of faith like a heartbeat in the stillness of the Church. The Carmelites, who had once been a fragile band of exiles in a foreign land, were now a spiritual family spread across continents and cultures, their brown habits as familiar in the deserts of Africa and the mountains of Latin America as in the cobbled streets of Europe. And yet, though the order grew vast, its heart remained small, small as the cell of a hermit, small as the piece of cloth that had once fallen into Simon's trembling hands. The centuries had brought change, but the spirit of Carmel, that tender balance between contemplation and service, between silence and love, endured, drawing strength from the promise first spoken in that long-ago vision. Simon's story had by then been written and rewritten many times. Artists painted him with the Virgin hovering above, her mantle wide as dawn, and theologians debated the meaning of the promise she had given. Yet what mattered most was never the precision of the words, but the tenderness of the encounter itself. The Virgin Mary had chosen to descend not into a palace or cathedral, but into the humble dwelling of a man who had lost all but faith. And that was the point that the Carmelites never ceased to teach, that heaven comes not to the powerful or the learned, but to the broken-hearted who dare still to hope. That truth was their inheritance, the living seed of their spirituality. Every friar who took the habit, every nun who cloistered herself in prayer, every layperson who wore the scapular upon their heart was, in a way, continuing Simon's surrender. Each became another voice in the same long hymn of trust. that God's mercy bends low, that Mary's arms are wide enough to gather even the most forsaken. In an age when the world began to measure greatness by the power of men and the speed of machines, the scapular remained a scandal of simplicity. It could not be explained in terms of progress or reason. It asked only for love. And love, when pure, always appears foolish to the proud. Yet for those who wore it, that small brown cloth was a silent defiance against the emptiness of modernity, a way of saying that human beings were made for something more than comfort or conquest. It reminded them that their dignity came not from achievement, but from being loved by God. Many who had turned from the church returned through this devotion, moved not by arguments, but by affection, not by grandeur, but by gentleness. They came to Mary as children come to a mother, bringing their failures, their fears, their fatigue, and she, as ever, pointed them back to her Son, whispering the same words she had once spoken at Cana. Do whatever he tells you. In quiet monasteries, Carmelites continued to pray for the world, not with loud petitions, but with steady faithfulness. They prayed for the poor, for the lost, for those who no longer believed. And each time they lifted their voices in the ancient hymn Flos Carmeli, they thought of Simon Stock, the first English Carmelite to hear those words not as music, but as mercy. He had lived and died centuries before, but his story was still their story. The hollow tree, the solitude, the suffering, all had become symbols of the soul's own journey, the dark night that purifies, the silence that becomes prayer, the emptiness that makes room for grace. The Carmelites often told their novices that Simon's tree was not only a place in the forest, but a place in the heart, a place each of them must one day enter, to be stripped of every illusion until only faith remained. The scapular, too, came to hold deeper meaning with time. It was no longer merely seen as a shield of protection, but as a garment of identity, a visible reminder that one belonged to Mary's family. To wear it was to be clothed in humility, to live beneath the mantle of trust. Countless miracles were attributed to it through the centuries, but the greatest miracle was always the same: the transformation of ordinary lives. The proud became meek, the despairing found courage, the indifferent learned to pray. Through the scapular, the Virgin continued to do what she had always done, to lead her children gently back to Christ. There were moments in history when the devotion seemed nearly forgotten. Wars scattered monasteries, revolutions silenced prayers. Yet, like the seed buried beneath the snow, it always returned. In the trenches of Europe, soldiers clutched it as they faced death. In concentration camps, it was passed in secret from hand to trembling hand. In the quiet of hospitals, nurses tucked it beneath the pillows of the dying. Always the same gesture, small, wordless, full of faith. And when peace returned, those who survived carried it still, a reminder that they had never been alone. Through it all, the image of Simon Stock endured as something more than a saintly figure. He was not remembered for miracles of healing or public preaching, but for endurance, for believing when no one else did. He became the patron of perseverance, of those who struggle unseen, of those who wait in silence for light that seems never to come. Pilgrims continued to visit his resting place in England, and though the world around them grew louder, they found there the same peace he had known. Many said that to kneel by his tomb was to feel again the hush of the forest, the breath of God moving gently through the branches. In the 20th century, Pope Pius XII renewed the Church's call to the scapular devotion, calling it a sign of consecration to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. He reminded the faithful that to wear it is to live under her guidance, to imitate her purity, to seek her Son in every circumstance. And in that renewal, the voice of Simon Stock seemed to rise again, carried through time like the echo of a bell. The humble garment of his vision became, once more, a sign of hope for a world wounded by pride. Even in the present age, when the noise of the world grows ever more relentless and faith seems to fade in many hearts, the scapular endures. It has found its way into the digital age, appearing in pockets and around necks, carried by those who seek stillness in the storm. The words of the promise remain the same. Whosoever dies clothed in this shall not suffer eternal fire. Yet even those who no longer take such words literally sense their deeper truth, that God's mercy is stronger than human weakness, and that to entrust oneself to Mary is to rest in the gentlest hands that ever touched creation. The story of Simon Stock, retold across 8 centuries, reminds each generation that sanctity is not a sudden blaze, but a long obedience in the same direction. It shows that the soul's hidden fidelity may outlast the monuments of empires. His hollow tree stands as a living parable, that the heart, when emptied of self, becomes the dwelling of God. And though his name is now spoken in many tongues, and his image painted in countless forms, the essence of his story remains the same. A man who waited, who wept, who believed, and who was answered not with thunder or triumph, but with the quiet gift of a mother's love. Perhaps this is why his legend never truly fades. For in every generation, there are those who find themselves alone, uncertain, afraid. And to them, his life speaks as gently as wind through leaves. It tells them that their solitude is not meaningless, that their prayers, though unseen, rise like incense before heaven, and that every dark night ends at last in dawn. The scapular, simple and brown, remains that dawn made visible, a thread of light worn against the heart, a whisper from a hermit's tree carried across the ages. And so long as one soul, somewhere, prays with faith as Simon did, his promise will continue to live, not as legend, but as living love. Even now, so many centuries after his body returned to dust, the spirit of St. Simon Stock lingers like the hush that follows the toll of a bell, faint but persistent, carried on the breath of devotion that has never ceased. The Carmelites, who trace their spiritual bloodline to his faith, still whisper his name in their evening offices, a small act of remembrance in the endless rhythm of the Church's prayer. Yet Simon himself has long since passed beyond remembrance. The peace he sought in the hollow of that tree has deepened into the stillness of eternity. Still, his story continues to move across time, not as a relic of medieval wonder, but as something startlingly alive, a parable for every soul that wrestles with silence, with despair, with the aching hunger for God. In the vast sweep of Christian history, his life is a quiet note, a simple melody that somehow holds the weight of eternity within its smallness. In the modern world, where faith often feels like a whisper lost amid the din of progress, Simon's story has gained a strange new power. The solitude he once embraced, which the world had pitied as madness, has become something many now long for. That inner stillness, that sacred withdrawal from the noise, where the heart can finally listen. People read about the Hermit of Kent, the man who lived in a tree, and in him they find not strangeness but kinship. His flight from the world is no longer seen as rejection, but as yearning, a yearning to see clearly, to love purely, to rest completely in God. In an age that measures life by activity and achievement, the image of Simon's hollow oak has become a symbol of something desperately needed: silence that heals, solitude that reveals, surrender that restores the soul's humanity. It is remarkable how often history returns to its saints when it grows tired of its idols. The Church, ever ancient and ever new, holds them like stars against the sky, letting their quiet light guide restless generations. Simon's light, faint yet unwavering, continues to shine through the devotion that bears his name. The Brown Scapular remains a small act of rebellion against the world's forgetfulness of God. It is a vow of belonging made by those who dare to remember that they are loved, even when the world tells them otherwise. And in that act of remembrance, Simon Stock still lives, not as a shadow in a legend, but as a companion in faith. In monasteries, the Carmelites still mark his feast each May with the same simplicity that he himself would have loved. The air fills with the scent of wax and wood polish, the candles flicker on worn altars, and the brothers chant the words of the ancient hymn, Flos Carmeli, the flower of Carmel, said to have been composed in his honor. It begins with a plea, Flos Carmeli, Vitis Florigera, Splendor Coeli, Virgo Puerpera, flower of Carmel, fruitful vine, splendor of heaven, virgin-bearing child. The chant rises softly through the cloister, filling the air with something older than language, something that belongs not to one century, but to eternity. Each note is a petition and a memory, a way of keeping Simon's prayer alive. And as the voices fade into silence, the brothers sit in stillness, knowing that they are part of the same unbroken chain of faith. From the prophet Elijah on Mount Carmel, to Simon in his tree, to themselves, kneeling in this modern world that so often forgets to kneel. Outside those cloisters, the devotion continues its quiet work. The scapular, so small it can be hidden beneath clothing, has found its way into every corner of the earth. It is worn by the poor and the powerful, by the anonymous and the known. In crowded cities and in lonely deserts, on hospital beds and in schoolyards, it hangs over countless hearts as a reminder that heaven's promise endures. A pilgrim in the Philippines prays before an image of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, clutching her scapular as she whispers her fears. A soldier in South America tucks his beneath his uniform, believing that whatever happens, Mary will be near. A dying grandmother in Italy blesses her grandchildren with trembling hands and places the same simple cloth upon their shoulders. In all these moments, Simon's vision lives again. The Virgin still bends over the world, still whispers her promise into the ears of her children, still gathers the lost beneath her mantle. There are those who, looking from outside the faith, cannot understand such devotion. To them, it seems naive to place trust in a piece of cloth. But the scapular is not superstition. It is the gospel made tangible, a symbol of the covenant that love has woven through creation. It is the same mystery that drew Simon into the hollow of his tree, that God, who is infinite, chooses to dwell in the finite, that grace hides itself in smallness, that salvation is offered not in thunder, but in tenderness. To wear the scapular is to say with one's whole being, I am not alone. It is to believe that the hand that once lifted a frightened fisherman from the sea still reaches toward the trembling heart of every believer. If one were to trace the path of the scapular through time, one would find that it has accompanied humanity through its every joy and trial. It was there when saints were martyred, when explorers set sail across unknown waters, when mothers prayed for sons who never returned from war. It was there in the hospitals of plague, in the prisons of tyrants, in the fields where the hungry worked and prayed. Each thread of the scapular seems woven from these human stories of fear and faith, of sorrow and surrender. And above them all, unseen yet unchanging, is the presence of the Virgin Mary, who, as Simon once knew, never abandons her children. In truth, Simon's life was never about the miracle of the vision itself, but about what came before and after. The long years of hiddenness, the humility to believe without reward, the endurance to hope in silence. These are the qualities that the modern world still needs and seldom understands. For even now, humanity is restless, searching for meaning in noise, for assurance in control. But the saints teach another way. They remind us that holiness is born not in the triumphs of the world, but in the willingness to be small. Simon Stock's greatness lay not in what he achieved, but in what he allowed God to make of him. He emptied himself until only grace remained. That is why his story continues to echo. Because every soul who feels unseen or forgotten can find in him a reflection of its own longing. And so, though the centuries may dim the details of his life, the essence of his witness endures. The hermit in the tree, the friar who wept for his brothers, the old man who trusted the voice of a mother. His life is a doorway through which countless souls have walked into hope. And as long as the scapular rests against even one faithful heart, as long as there is one soul who still dares to whisper a prayer into the silence, the promise of that night long ago will remain alive. For the Virgin's words to Simon were never meant for him alone. They were a seed planted in human history, destined to bloom in every age. Perhaps one day, when all the noise of the world has passed away, the truth of that promise will stand clear. The humble will shine, the forgotten will be remembered, and every hidden act of faith will be revealed as the light that held the world together. Then Simon's long vigil will be complete, his solitude fulfilled in the communion of all who have ever trusted in mercy. And the scapular, that small, silent thread of love, will be seen for what it always was, not merely a garment, but a promise made flesh, a sign that even in the world's darkest night, heaven still leans close enough to touch. The centuries, unhurried and faithful, have carried St. Simon Stock into that realm where history softens into legend and legend deepens into devotion. Time has done what time always does. It has weathered the world, changed languages, moved nations, and forgotten kings, yet somehow it has never forgotten the hermit of the tree. His story remains like a flame sheltered in cupped hands, trembling yet unextinguished, casting its quiet glow across the generations. The Carmelites, who once lived as wanderers and outcasts, now move confidently through the life of the Church, but they have not outgrown the humility of their origin. They still sing the hymns he prayed, still wear the scapular that fell from heaven into his trembling hands, still honor the Virgin as their mother and queen. And in every chapel that bears the name of Mount Carmel, there is an unspoken gratitude to the man who bore the darkness long enough for light to find its way back into the world. When pilgrims kneel today at the altars dedicated to Our Lady of Mount Carmel, most know little of the old friar's years of suffering, his doubts, or the deep loneliness that marked his life. They see the image of Mary, serene and radiant, holding the brown scapular in her hands, and beside her, the stooped figure of the saint, awed and small beneath her gaze. Yet even if they do not know his story in detail, they know its essence. They feel it in the air of those sanctuaries, in the stillness between prayers, the sense that this devotion was born from sorrow transfigured into grace. The brown scapular is no mere symbol of comfort. It is the fruit of one man's crucible, of the long silence that tested his soul. To wear it is to touch the memory of his endurance, to remember that even despair can become an altar if it is offered to God. Over the centuries, countless lives have been braided invisibly into Simon's story. The Carmelites record miracles and healings, but also quieter wonders, the peace of a heart once restless, the conversion of a soul once hardened, the consolation of a mother's prayer answered in an hour of fear. Such moments are not written in books, yet they are the true history of his legacy. Each scapular that passes from one hand to another is an unspoken continuation of that night in the priory, when heaven bent low to touch the earth. Every person who wears it carries within them the same invitation that the Virgin once extended to Simon: to trust without seeing, to persevere without proof, to believe that love is stronger than the world's ruin. In monasteries and convents, the feast of Saint Simon Stock is marked each May with tender solemnity. The brothers rise before dawn, the chapel cool and fragrant with incense. The chant of Flos Carmeli rises softly in the half-light, that ancient hymn which tradition says flowed from his heart in a moment of rapture. The words, simple yet filled with longing, have become the anthem of Carmel across 8 centuries. Flower of Carmel, vine blossom laden, splendor of heaven, childbearing maiden, none equals thee. As they sing, one can almost imagine Simon himself among them, his worn hands clasped, his old eyes glistening with gratitude. For though his body has long since turned to dust, the rhythm of his prayer continues, echoing through the voices of his sons and daughters, across mountains and oceans, across generations that never saw his face yet live by his faith. Outside those cloisters, the scapular devotion continues to thread its way quietly through the life of the Church. Popes bless it, pilgrims wear it, and children receive it at their first communion. It is found hanging from rear-view mirrors, folded in pockets, sewn into wedding gowns, laid gently in coffins. The world that Simon once knew has changed beyond recognition. Men now fly through the air, speak across continents, pierce the mysteries of stars, and yet the small brown scapular remains. It survives because its message speaks not to intellect, but to the heart. It asks nothing elaborate, promises nothing worldly. It simply offers a choice: to live as one who belongs to Mary, to remember that in the vast loneliness of existence, there is still a mother's gaze upon the soul. There is a quiet strength in that promise, one that has carried the faithful through ages of turmoil. In times of persecution, the scapular was worn in secret. In times of peace, it was worn in gratitude. During wars, it was tucked beneath uniforms. During famine, it was all some people had left to give their children. In every age, it has been the poor who understood it best. They knew that holiness was not luxury, but endurance, that Mary's love was not sentimental, but steadfast. They saw in Simon's life the reflection of their own, the long struggle to believe in goodness while living among hardships, the faith that clings to hope even when all visible reason for hope has vanished. The scapular was their answer to despair, their quiet affirmation that God doesn't forget those who wait in love. The Church, in recognizing Simon's sanctity, did not canonize a visionary of dazzling miracles, but a man who endured the night and emerged faithful. He was not a saint of thunderous revelations, but of patient fidelity. His holiness was built not upon triumph, but upon trust. That, perhaps, is why his story still resonates. In a world that idolizes success, Simon Stock stands as a reminder that grace often hides itself in failure's disguise, and that those who seem most forgotten by the world may be the ones closest to God. His life says to every soul that struggles, "You are seen, you are held, and your prayer, even when it feels unanswered, has already reached heaven." Some have said that the brown scapular is the gentle twin of the rosary, one woven from words, the other from silence. Both are Marian gifts, both are pathways of contemplation, both draw the soul toward the same truth, that love, once offered, endures forever. The scapular, resting quietly against the chest, is like the heartbeat of that truth, steady, unseen, continuous, And perhaps that is how Simon would wish to be remembered, not through statues or hymns, but through the unbroken rhythm of love that moves unseen through the world, small as a breath, strong as eternity. Pilgrims who travel to the sites of Carmel's heritage often speak of an inexplicable peace that seems to hover in those places, whether it be the ruins of Aylesford, where Simon once lived, or the slopes of Mount Carmel itself, where the first hermits prayed. They say the air there feels lighter, the silence deeper, as if something sacred still lingers just beyond hearing. Perhaps it is imagination, perhaps it is grace. But either way, it is a fitting echo of Simon's life, a life that began in solitude and ended in communion, that found in abandonment the seed of belonging. His hermit's heart, once hidden in the hollow of a tree, has become the heart of a vast and living family, scattered across the world, but united in prayer beneath Mary's mantle. In the end, Simon Stock's story is not about one man's sanctity, but about the mystery of how God weaves redemption through the smallest threads of human frailty. It is the story of how a hidden life can bear fruit that outlives empires, how a whispered prayer can become a song that endures for centuries. He sought nothing but God, and in finding him, gave the world a sign that still saves the weary. The Virgin's promise to Simon was not just for the Carmelites, but for every soul that dares to believe that grace can bloom in the darkest soil. And perhaps that is the final meaning of his life, that heaven's greatest miracles often begin with the trembling of one human heart in prayer. The story of Saint Simon Stock, passed through centuries of devotion and whispered prayer, has long since become more than a chapter in history. It has turned into something living and fluid, like the tide that never ceases to return to the shore. Wherever faith endures, his name seems to drift quietly upon it. For though he once lived alone, buried in the hollow of a tree and forgotten by the world, the fruits of his solitude have outlived kingdoms and carried comfort into hearts that never knew his face. The Carmelites, who still call him Father, speak of him not as a figure of the past, but as a presence, one who walks unseen through their cloisters, who kneels beside them in prayer, who whispers courage into their hearts when silence grows too heavy. His life, they say, is like a lamp hidden beneath the folds of time, still burning, still reminding the Church that holiness does not require the world's applause, only the steady turning of a soul toward God. The Brown Scapular, that small and fragile garment which began in the anguish of his prayer, has become one of the most beloved devotions in the Christian world. It has crossed oceans, survived persecutions, and rested against the hearts of countless saints and sinners alike. To many, it is a sacrament of belonging, a quiet declaration that one's life is entrusted to the Virgin's care. The faithful who wear it do not imagine themselves shielded from suffering. They know that pain, too, has its place in divine love, but they believe that within that pain, a maternal hand still guides, still guards, still lifts. In this belief lies the enduring tenderness of Simon's legacy. He has taught humanity to trust not in the absence of sorrow, but in the presence of mercy. In every generation, there are those who rediscover him. Artists paint his vision with renewed reverence. Scholars study his life with awe at its mystery. Yet for all the retelling, what continues to touch hearts is not the miracle itself, but the man behind it, the one who waited through decades of silence before heaven answered. His was not a sanctity born in sudden light, but in the long fidelity of obscurity. It is the kind of holiness that does not dazzle but consoles. When weary souls read of him, they recognize themselves, his loneliness, his struggle, his hope that flickered but never died. and in recognizing him, they find courage to continue their own prayer, however unanswered it may seem. That is Simon's truest miracle, not that the Virgin appeared to him, but that through him she continues to appear to those who need her most. If one listens closely to the voice of history, one hears that the Church herself has carried Simon's story as a kind of melody of endurance. There are centuries when faith burned brightly, and centuries when it grew dim, but through it all, the scapular remained. Popes have blessed it, poets have written of it, and peasants have worn it without ever knowing the theology behind it. In great cathedrals, and in the humblest homes, the same brown cloth is placed over shoulders with the same words. Receive this blessed scapular. Whoever dies clothed in it shall not suffer eternal fire. For many, those words are not a formula but a heartbeat, the echo of Mary's tenderness extended across time. When the world changes, when life becomes uncertain, that promise feels like the one constant thread in the great fabric of creation. The Carmelites, true to Simon's spirit, have never claimed ownership of this gift. They have always offered it freely, as he did. Their monasteries, wherever they stand, in the deserts of Africa, the mountains of Peru, the cities of Europe, are not fortresses of exclusivity, but gardens of prayer where anyone may come to rest in silence. Within those walls, the scapular is still made by hand, its threads woven in prayer. The friars speak of it not as a relic, but as a living bond. To wear it, they say, is to stand with Simon beneath the gaze of Mary, to learn as he did that faith is not about control, but surrender. It is to understand that in God's design, nothing given in love is ever lost. Not a tear, not a sigh, not a single hidden moment of patience. And so his legacy is not a monument, but a movement, gentle, invisible, unstoppable. In the 20th century, when wars once again covered the world with suffering, the scapular became a sign of peace among chaos. Soldiers carried it into battle. Prisoners clasped it as they awaited death. In villages scarred by hunger and fear, mothers gave it to their children, whispering the same words Simon once heard. You are not alone. In every one of those moments, the Virgin's promise, whosoever dies clothed in this shall not suffer eternal fire, was heard not as a guarantee of escape, but as a pledge of companionship, a reminder that even in death, love abides. When humanity's faith seemed to fracture, the scapular stitched it together again, thread by humble thread. In the years that followed, the devotion found new forms. Scapular confraternities were founded in parishes. Pilgrimages to Carmelite shrines flourished. The Church, discerning the fruits of centuries, reaffirmed the authenticity of Simon's vision, not as a command of doctrine, but as an invitation to trust. Theologians spoke of the scapular as the gospel in miniature, the story of the Incarnation woven into two small pieces of cloth. The Virgin, they said, who once wrapped the eternal Word in swaddling clothes, now wraps her children in the same symbol of divine tenderness. And in that thought lies the entire heart of Christian mystery, that God's infinite mercy chooses always to make itself small enough to be touched. Even now, in the present age where faith is often questioned and silence feels like absence, the scapular endures with a stubborn grace. It hangs quietly from the necks of the faithful in bustling cities and faraway villages, a small witness against despair. It whispers to a generation that fears insignificance, that God still works in the small and the hidden. And when weariness or doubt overwhelms, it reminds them of the hermit who once thought himself forgotten, who prayed in darkness, who was visited by light, and who learned that love never truly leaves the one who waits. The scapular, in this sense, is less a relic than a rhythm. the rhythm of faith that continues beating even when the world grows cold. In the grand arc of salvation history, Simon's life might seem a footnote, yet his story holds something the world cannot afford to lose. It holds the truth that holiness is born not in brilliance, but in perseverance, not in the noise of achievement, but in the patience of trust. His hollow tree was a place of surrender, and from that surrender came the renewal of an entire order, the comfort of millions, the living legacy of a garment that has outlasted centuries. And even now, in the unseen spaces of the heart, his lesson continues, that if one dares to give everything to God, even despair can become fertile ground for hope. Perhaps that is why the Church still places Simon Stock among her saints, not because of grandeur or miracles that astound, but because his life is the echo of the gospel itself. He lived poor and obscure, he prayed through darkness, and in his surrender he became the instrument of mercy. The scapular, like his soul, is woven of humility, and so long as it rests against the hearts of the faithful, his story will not end. For every generation that wears it anew becomes a continuation of his vision, a living testimony that what began as one man's prayer in the wilderness has become the Church's heartbeat of hope. Centuries have softened the world that Simon Stock once knew. The forests of Kent have thinned, the language he spoke has aged into something half foreign, and the Church that formed his world has grown into a vast and global family. Yet his story endures, not as a relic buried under the dust of history, but as something breathing, something that continues to whisper to the restless heart of humanity. For beneath all the noise of time, beneath every struggle of empires and generations, there remains that same quiet human ache for belonging, the yearning to be seen by God, to be gathered into love, to know that our suffering is not forgotten. That is why St. Simon Stock's story still matters. It is not a tale of the past. It is the parable of every soul that has ever knelt in darkness and waited for dawn. The image of the hermit in his hollow tree has become an icon of this waiting. It is an image of contradiction. A man buried in the earth who somehow touches heaven. Within that cramped and lonely dwelling, Simon lived what the mystics would later call the hidden life, where the soul sheds every earthly attachment until only the pure longing for God remains. His solitude was not escape, but offering. The world may have seen him as one who fled from men, but heaven saw him as one who ran toward the divine. That secret, that one can be nearer to God in obscurity than in acclaim, is what makes his story timeless. It is the same truth that every saint eventually learns, and that every believer must face in some form, that holiness is not a ladder to climb, but a surrender to fall into. The world today, with all its advances, has perhaps never been more distant from silence, never more resistant to stillness. Yet in this modern age of constant motion, Simon's life speaks with renewed force. People read of his years of isolation, his prayers that echoed unanswered through the wood, and something within them stirs, a faint memory of the soul's own hunger for quiet. They recognize that his solitude mirrors their own inner emptiness, the hidden ache for peace that no comfort can fill. The hollow tree becomes a mirror for the hollow heart. And through that recognition comes hope. If grace could find him there, forgotten and broken, then perhaps it can find anyone. For this is the essence of Simon Stock's message, not the miracle of the scapular alone, but the truth it carries, that divine mercy descends into the lowest places. The Virgin did not appear in a palace or to a man of power. She came to one who had nothing left but faith. In doing so, she revealed something the world always forgets, that heaven's light seeks the shadows, that glory loves humility, that redemption begins in the most unlikely hearts. That single vision, born from Simon's agony, transformed the fate of his order and rippled through centuries of souls. It remains a quiet revolution against the world's values, a reminder that God's greatest works are hidden beneath simplicity. There is, too, a profound tenderness in how the story ends, not in triumph, but in peace. Simon's death, gentle and unheralded, closed a life that had been one long offering. The brothers who found him spoke of the serenity that rested on his face, as though he had merely fallen asleep in prayer. And perhaps he had. For the man who once cried out to God from a hollow tree had finally been gathered into the heart of the one he sought. The virgin who had come to him in vision surely came again, unseen, to guide him home. It is easy to imagine that, in that final moment, Simon saw once more the same light that filled his hermitage long ago, and that he heard again her voice, soft as dawn. "You have done what was asked of you. Come and rest." But death did not end his work. The seed of his suffering had already taken root in the world. The scapular, born from his faith, continued to move silently through history, uniting generations who would never meet, but who would share the same trust. Across the centuries, it has been touched by hands calloused from labor, by fingers weakened with age, by children learning their first prayers. It has rested on the hearts of those who died alone, reminding them that no death is truly solitary. It has hung around the necks of saints, popes, and beggars alike, equalizing them in the humility of grace. Its threads have absorbed tears, carried hope, and witnessed forgiveness. And through it all, Simon's hidden life has continued to bear fruit, not through power, but through presence. To the Carmelites, the scapular remains more than cloth. It is their identity, their mission woven into thread. When a novice receives it upon entering the order, the gesture repeats the moment of Simon's vision. The superior places the garment over the young man's shoulders and prays that he may live beneath Mary's protection. The cloth is light, but the meaning is weighty. It is a sign of belonging, a daily reminder to live in purity, simplicity, and love. In that moment, the centuries collapse, and the young friar stands symbolically beside the old hermit of Kent, both united in the same trust. Outside the monasteries, the devotion lives among the people. In every corner of the world, there are small miracles of fidelity. An old woman in Poland who survived the war attributes her courage to the scapular she wore since childhood. A missionary in Asia gives one to a dying man who smiles through his tears and says, "Now I am not afraid." A mother in South America teaches her children to kiss it each morning before school. None of these stories will ever be recorded, yet they form the true continuation of Simon's legacy. It is not found in history books, but in the hearts of believers who, through a simple piece of cloth, learn to trust that heaven has not forgotten them. And what of the hollow tree? Time has long since taken it back to the earth, its wood decayed, its roots turned to soil. Yet the place where it once stood still draws pilgrims who come to pray among the green hills of Kent. There is no monument there, no grand basilica, only a small stone and the whisper of wind. Yet those who stand there say they can feel something in the air, a presence, a stillness, a kind of waiting. Perhaps it is the echo of Simon's prayer, still alive in the ground where he once knelt. The earth remembers holiness, just as the soul remembers grace. And so, long after his body has vanished, the land that sheltered him continues to tell his story without words. At the end of all things, what remains of Simon's stock is not a legend to be admired, but an invitation to be lived. His life teaches that sanctity is not about escaping the world, but about finding God within it, in silence, in suffering, in surrender. The scapular that the Virgin placed in his hands remains the Church's quiet reminder that divine love dwells not in splendor, but in humility. To wear it is to enter into his secret, to carry within one's own life the mystery of his faith. That no heart that loves, no soul that waits, no prayer that rises from darkness is ever lost. And so the story returns to its beginning, to the paradox of a man who hid himself away only to be found by heaven. The hermit in the tree became the keeper of a promise that outlived him, a promise that still binds the human heart to its eternal home. His life, like the scapular itself, is simple, humble, and indestructible. And in every age, as the world grows weary of its own noise, the wind through the trees of Kent seems to carry the same ancient whisper. Be still. Wait. Grace is nearer than you think.